So, like many couples nowadays, Mike, I actually met my wife on Tinder. True story. And I won't go into the whole backstory, but I will tell you that back then, the app didn't allow you to pick prompts, custom prompts. These are like questions you could put on your profile to make you sound smarter and allow you to be creative. I would have been on the app much less if they'd have if they'd been there in my time. But I was looking through them today, and I thought they'd be a great way to open the podcast. Okay.
So this has me nervous.
The one I liked most was this one. The prompt goes, "A shower thought I had recently was."
Okay.
Tell me your shower thoughts if you can, if they're broadcastable.
Yes. So something I have been thinking about is, when is it appropriate to have, this is going in an okay direction, don't worry. When is it appropriate to have a conversation with an AI chatbot, and when is it maybe problematic?
Interesting. Okay.
All right. And so what kind of shower thoughts have you been having?
Well, this is quite revealing, but my shower thought was, who will Mike Masnick direct his ire and frustration to when Thierry Breton is no longer in post? And it turns out we're going to find that out.
Yes, we will.
Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. This week's episode is brought to you with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund. My name is Ben Whitelaw. I'm the founder and editor of Everything in Moderation, and I'm back in the chair, back side by side, talking about our intimate thoughts with Mike Masnick, founder of Tech Dirt. Mike, how are you? How's your week been?
I have been doing quite well. It's been another busy week. There are lots of things going on in the world, but overall pretty good, and fun to hear about your history with Tinder. I think everything that I got married in the pre-Tinder era, and never had to go through the dating apps, though lots of people seem to really like them, and obviously you met your wife there. That is wonderful.
Fairly successful. I think it's a decent hit rate.
But I know lots of people who have found their significant others that way, and I think it's great.
Yeah, and they do a fairly decent job as a bunch of platforms of moderating content, which is something we'll talk about at various points over the coming episodes. We've had a couple of really nice reviews since we last were on the podcast. We mainly because I think people were fed up of our incessant pleading. I don't know how you feel about it, but there's been a nice few rolling in over the last few weeks since I've been on.
Yeah, there have been some really, really nice reviews. And so again, we'll recommend, if you like the podcast, I guess even if you don't like the podcast, you can also write a review. But we certainly appreciate the very nice reviews. So we had a couple of very nice ones. Someone called it First Rate, and talking about how some other podcasts were maybe a little too musky, but ours
musky as in smelly, or
I think they meant a little too focused on one Elon person. Okay. We do mention him occasionally, but as this review notes, ours covers more platforms, more countries, and more thorny problems that need resolution, which is definitely part of our goal. We had another really nice one that this is a pretty long one, which is great, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. But they talk about how things look and seem easy from the outside, and it's very easy to assume that there are easy answers to all these things, but that we do a really good job of explaining how, as you listen to the podcast, you will realize how difficult these decisions are and how often there simply isn't a good answer to a given content moderation question. So I really appreciated that one as well.
Yeah, talking about the trust and safety professionals rather than us as podcast hosts.
Yes.
Crucial distinction.
Yes, absolutely. And then we had one, which is also a very nice one, though I will note that it says, that they enjoy listening to it and that the discussions are great and all this stuff, but it does say it isn't necessarily the most entertaining podcast, at least in the traditional sense, which I'm not quite sure what the traditional sense of entertaining podcast is. But we have not gotten up to that bar, Ben.
No, okay. We need to make it more entertaining, don't we? We need to.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about, showers and dating apps. I mean, that's a start. That's surely got to be a start.
Do we need like sound effects, air horns,
Yeah.
and or do we need like a wacky sidekick? Maybe that's it.
I thought that was me. Anyway, I think we'll have to ponder on that. Maybe some side effects.
There we go.
Maybe some visuals as well. We need to get on camera and show our faces. Maybe that's what it is.
Oh, geez, maybe.
We'll see.
You know the term a face made for radio, right?
Yeah, we might have to wear masks, both of us.
We'll see.
But that's really helpful. And yeah, thanks to the listeners for taking the time to rate and review us on the platforms where you listen. It's really, really helpful. Last week's podcast was great. Mike did a fantastic job with Rihanna Pfefferkorn from Stanford. We've got another whole tranche of stories this week that we're going to run through in as detailed but as swift a time as possible. And we're going to start, Mike, with both some good news and some bad news, as you've no doubt been following. The good news that Thierry Breton is no longer in post at the European Commission. But the bad news is that you won't be able to rant about him for any longer. It's a bittersweet news in many respects.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit of surprise, I think, because the commission was, there's a new slate of commissioners who are going to be presented this past week, and each country gets to designate someone for the commission, and then that slate then eventually has to get approved by the EU Parliament. And Macron had put forth Breton again, and so he had been listed. And then the story that came out was that Ursula von der Leyen had sent a message to Macron basically saying that if you don't pull Breton's designation and replace him with someone else, he's going to get a really weak portfolio. And there's always the issue of who gets which portfolio and which, and the bigger countries, the Frances and the Germanys, want the high profile ones. And basically she was saying he was going to be doing something with like fisheries or who knows what. And so Breton obviously found out about that, and so he sent a somewhat petulant letter, that's a little fitting with his character, basically saying that, I understand that you asked Macron to designate somebody else for reasons outside of the official ones, suggesting some sort of personal issues, and therefore I am resigning immediately. It's a
pretty simmering letter, wasn't it?
Yeah. And so there's lots of questions as to what was actually going on. It might be as simple as Breton, beyond being sort of brash and making sure that his name is out there, and as I've joked about, every time he posts on social media, it comes with a high quality photo of himself. He just seems like someone who thinks highly of himself and wants pictures of himself everywhere. Unlike us being concerned about our faces made for radio, he wants to be everywhere. But, back in March, he had really criticized her and in fact suggested that she should not lead the EU this next term. And so I think there was some animosity that probably lived on from that. I think also, it could have something to do with, we had spoken about, he had sent this letter to Elon Musk before Musk had done the spaces with Donald Trump, kind of warning him that he might face some punishment. And there were reports that the rest of the EU Commission was totally unaware of that. It took them by surprise, and they were upset, and they thought it was a problem and that he was undermining the seriousness of the DSA. Right. And I wouldn't be surprised if that had some calculation in the request as well, and sort of this recognition that he was a bit of a loose cannon and was doing some things that could undermine the larger project of the EU and their attempt to regulate social media.
Yeah, it definitely become very personality driven, hadn't it? Musk versus Breton. We talked about them being kind of two macho, kind of almost like gorilla type figures beating their chests against one another. And that's really where a lot of the media coverage had focused in some of those discussions. And I'm going to read out the quote from Politico from that story just after the Donald Trump space again, because it's fantastic. Politico had this anonymous quote saying that he'd become an attention-seeking politician in search of his next big job. And once somebody says that about you and it gets read by wonks in Brussels in a publication like Politico, your race is run, I think. It was both surprising and once it kind of sat with me for a day or two. I was like, that kind of makes 100%
Yeah.
sense.
So, I mean, there is a question of what is that next big job? Now
true.
he's got to find one. So there may be more opportunities for me to yell at him, but it won't be as a part of the EU Commission. So
No. And I don't think he'll be welcomed within the ex-Twitter leadership.
Can you
anytime
imagine
soon.
if he's the X's Nick Clegg?
Yeah. Nice little kind of global affairs job coming up.
Yeah.
Nice move to San Francisco, maybe. Yeah, I mean, Musk obviously responded in the way that Musk only knows, which is to tweet "Bon voyage" to the letter from Breton, and they had a nice bit of a back and forth there. So it's still going on. They will still provide fodder for the podcast, even though that he's no longer in post. But my question, Mike, is like, who is going to replace Breton in your line of fire, if I can call it that? What do we know about, the person who's going to replace Breton, what brief they've got, kind of person with completely different kind of makeup and experience in a way?
Yeah, so the proposed slate, and again, the EU Parliament has to approve this, but I haven't seen any indication that they wouldn't, is that Henna Virkkunen has been proposed to handle this brief. And she is a Finnish lawmaker. She's been in the EU Parliament for a while, apparently had something to do with the DSA and writing the DSA, isn't involved with it. The letter that was sent to her sort of listing out the things that would be part of her portfolio is pretty broad and sort of tech. There's a lot of different tech elements to it, but it's pretty open-ended. You're talking about things with AI, next wave of frontier technologies, cloud and cloud development, CHIPS Act, secure, fast, and reliable connectivity, cybersecurity, all of these different things. And then sort of at the very end of the discussion, it talks about the DSA and the DMA, and then even something about you will help combat unethical techniques online, such as dark patterns, marketing by social media influencers, and addictive design of digital products. So things like that are within her portfolio. It'll be interesting to see how she handles it. It does feel like a larger part of her mission statement is really going to be about competition. And there have been all of these other discussions recently about how the EU has really fallen behind in competitiveness, especially within the tech industry. And there have been these discussions going on for a long time. You don't have any sort of really, or at least too many very large technology companies emerging from the EU. And the EU economy has suffered, especially within the last decade or so, at least compared to the US. And so there are definite concerns there. There are some people who will immediately point to some of the regulatory positions that the EU has taken that may have something to do with it. There may be a bunch of other issues related to it that, it's not really clear. So what'll be interesting to see is how much her focus is actually on competitiveness versus more narrowly focused on things like the DSA and the DMA. I do think that if the overarching theme of her portfolio is competition, hopefully that will lead to a broader, more comprehensive view of how these things play together. One of my big complaints, and this is everywhere where internet regulations come up, is how they're sort of viewed as silos. You have competition here, you have privacy there, you have disinformation over there, and yet all these things impact one another. And so if you have somebody who is taking a comprehensive look at this stuff, because like one of the classic examples is like the GDPR, which is one of the, it's a data protection regulation, touches on privacy issues. And there were a bunch of studies that suggested that actually diminished competition, especially in sort of the advertising space within the EU, because smaller companies were sort of driven out of business by the GDPR. That's a very big simplification. I'm not going to get into more of the details, but like taking a step back and saying like, what is actually going to drive competition while also working on these other policy levers at the same time could be a good thing. I think that when politicians get too narrowly focused on a particular thing, as if it's a silo without recognizing how it impacts these other things, that's where you run into problems. And so, look, whether or not she ends up in my line of fire of angry speech, we'll see. But I'm willing to give her a shot. I mean, let's see what she comes up with and what her focus is, and maybe it is more thoughtful, careful policy, and I would be happy to see that.
Yeah. I mean, her title of Executive Vice President for Tech Sovereignty, Security, Democracy does feel like a large umbrella. And the list, as you say, of to-dos on
Yes.
her list is very long. It's worth noting as well that, it's gone down very well in Finland that she's got this post, because Finnish politicians, Finnish MEPs don't typically get a job as big as this. And so that's a kind of big, interesting change. I'm not that familiar with tech policy in Finland. We'll have to kind of gen up on that over the next kind of weeks and months, but maybe there's some clues in there as to how she will approach the role and what she'll bring to it. Politico also report, crucially, and this is the most important thing we'll share with listeners today, is that she's a horse fan and a Ironman runner. So if you just want to get a sense of what she's like outside of outside of work, that's what she does for fun.
And apparently she uses Instagram more than X, whereas Breton was a big X user. She uses Instagram, but she posts like training stuff for her Ironman training is a part of how she uses that. And so this is somebody who has endurance, is what I'll say. If you're doing an Ironman, that is impressive.
Yeah, no, indeed. So she seems to have all the characteristics of somebody able to go head to head with Elon Musk and others of his ilk. So big change at the head of the EU Commission. We're going to see how that pans out. And let's move on to our next story, which is one of the platforms that Henna Virkkunen will be thinking about, and which already has an EU investigation pending on it. It's Instagram and a bunch of new features that they have launched this week for what it calls teen accounts. Now, when the New York Times claims that a change like this within a platform is, quote, the most far-reaching set of measures undertaken by an app to address teenagers' use of social media, you kind of sit up and take notice.
Yes.
Right? That's how it's being billed. And just to give you a sense of kind of what it involves, many people will have seen this be announced this week. Essentially, accounts for users under 18 are going to be made private by default. And this is something that's going to roll out. Current accounts by users who are under 18 are going to flip to being private. So there's an interesting cadence of which that's happening. In the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia, that's going to happen almost immediately. It's going to happen in the next few weeks. And then in the EU, that's going to happen over the rest of the year. And we can talk about why those countries have been picked, Mike, in a second. The bigger shift as well is that if you want to make your account public as one of those under 18 users, you can do that if you're 17 or 18, but if you're under 16, you're going to need to get parental permission for that. So a big change in the kind of parental involvement in the safety features that a child uses on their Instagram account. And there's a couple other things rolled up in that as well. So as a parent, you'll be able to see the people who are messaging your child. You won't be able to see the content of those messages, but you can see who is in their DMs. You'll be able to change the sensitive content measures and be able to restrict those according to what you feel is a kind of appropriate level. And Instagram are also going to limit notifications for under 18s between the hours of 10 and 7. So this is a kind of ploy to try and get, I guess, kids to go to sleep earlier, to have more sleep. And all of those changes are starting on Instagram, but they're going to, in theory, roll out across other Meta platforms next year as well. So a big shift really in how Instagram is thinking about teen safety. What is your kind of initial reaction to this, Mike? Why now? What do you feel about this as a change?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting on a variety of levels. It is obviously a big change. It is a lot of the stuff that people have been pushing for. There is one element of it, and we can discuss sort of how this came about, which is that in the US, at least, while there have been attempts to pass laws to require certain things similar to this or within the same arena, those laws don't really exist, or to the effect that ones have been passed that would require similar things, they've generally been found to be unconstitutional. So there is not a legal reason for them to do it in the US. Elsewhere is a little bit different. But they still did it. So there is a part of me that sees this as a response to the claims that, Meta and other big tech companies don't care and will not do anything until there is legislation in place because they did this. There is the reality that we've seen, which is that companies do care about this stuff, and companies don't like to have headlines about how children feel bad on the platform or that bad things happen by users of their platform. And
Mm.
so there is a reason why a trust and safety industry exists. Now, there are a lot of competing factors in that, and the trust and safety teams tragically do not run these companies, and often there are other interests and other stakeholders involved that will sometimes overrule what trust and safety thinks is important. The question then is, how much of this is driven by Meta wanting to actually make Instagram safer and being sick of these kinds of headlines, and how much of it is driven by there is this ongoing pressure all the time by this regulation, by different regulatory attempts. And that's something of an unknown. Like, I think back to, this was a discussion that I got into maybe 20 years ago or so around like net neutrality fights, where there were proposed laws for net neutrality in Congress. And I was worried about the laws, but I am broadly supportive of the idea of net neutrality. And there was an argument that was first put forth by Ed Felton, who's a professor at Princeton, really, really thoughtful guy on tech policy stuff. I think he worked at the FTC for a little while, and he's just been a really, really thoughtful commenter on all sorts of tech policy things. And I'm pretty sure he made this argument first 20 years ago, and then I just sort of picked up on it. This idea that like the best net neutrality tech policy was not an actual law, because the actual law and whatever was specific in that law would have problems and unintended consequences and all of that. But the concept of net neutrality was really important. So the best policy was continually threatening a law, but never actually getting there. So you have, I think he described it sort of like the sword of Damocles that's sort of hanging above your head, where like if you don't do anything, we're going to regulate. We'll probably regulate badly. So do something to fix it.
Yep.
And there's a sense that maybe this is kind of what's happening here. Like in the US context, certainly there's KOSA, the Kids Online Safety Act, which moved a little bit forward this week, but also there are indications that it's not actually going to get passed. It passed out of committee, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, though a different version that passed out of the Senate. And there are complaints and there are concerns about the bill still. And it feels like it's not going to have the momentum to actually pass this year. Okay. But here's an example of just even the fact that that is being debated and various states are debating things. The Instagram is coming forth and saying, look, we're doing a whole bunch of stuff. And whether or not all these things are good or not, or whether or not there's some problematic aspects, and they're expanding their age verification tools among the other things that they're doing to make all this work. Parental controls are sort of sometimes really good, occasionally problematic if you have a kid who's maybe LGBTQ and their parents are not accepting of that. There are concerns about, does parental controls lead to a situation that could actually be dangerous for those kids in certain situations as well? There are all of these kinds of questions, but I think Meta taking a step forward and just building out these tools, offering these tools, setting things up where the defaults are a little bit different, it seems like a good thing. It seems like they're, making steps in the right direction. I think it's good if it sort of becomes the standard that more and more companies just think about doing this without having to wait for the legal requirements to do it. And I think, we'd be in a better world if more companies were seeing that. And other companies have done some of these features before. I know Discord, for example, has a bunch of features that are fairly similar to some of the things that are here. I think it's a good thing if more companies are doing this kind of thing, but without the legal requirement. Once you have that sort of the liability aspect and locking you into certain things, which may not be the best or may not be the most appropriate, allowing the companies themselves to experiment and try different things and see what actually works, I think would be a good thing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the sort of Damocles analogy is a really good one. And if you think about it as well, from obviously the KOSA debate and discussion is informing this change, but also what we've seen in Europe as well. I think, if you look at the timings of the changes that Meta have made with regards to teen safety over the past couple of years, they line up pretty neatly with when the DSA was being talked about and when it was planned to be launched. The big change that they made just 6 months ago was introducing another default where teens could only be messaged or added to a chat if they were following an account or connected to them. And again, like pretty big change in the course of the way the messaging worked. Why did they do it at that point? Probably in part because of regulation, as you say, and probably in part due to the investigation that the DSA was, had brought out against Meta, of which child safety is part of it. And then the other point which you kind of make is, yes, there's headlines. And we've seen a hell of a lot of headlines, and we've talked about a hell of a lot of headlines where Instagram is very much involved in some of those really tough sextortion stories and cases. And it's not that long ago where Mark Zuckerberg had to get up and turn around and apologize to parents, right? It's only the start of the year. It feels much longer ago for the company's part in some of those tragic cases. So we're seeing a kind of push and pull, I think, in many respects from probably, media coverage of some of the harms and also the Damocles sword effect of regulation. And it's culminating in these quite significant changes, as you said. Is there kind of any more to it than that? How do you see it kind of going from here? Do we think there's going to be more defaults? I mean, this is a big suite of changes. Like, where's next?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that they're going to keep testing stuff and trying different stuff. And actually, that is one of the reasons why I think it's generally better if they're free to do that without like a regulatory specific, like you have to change this, this, and this, because it's not entirely clear which of these changes will have the most impact, or even if the impact will be good. Like, again, like as I mentioned, there could be some negative impacts to this, and learning from that and being able to adjust and experiment and try different things, I think is actually really important. So we'll see. I mean, I do think it's absolutely true that the DSA sort of hangs over all of this, and some of the other laws, the Online Safety Act and whatnot, are hanging over this. And I think that obviously these companies recognize that to be sort of global providers in this space, that is the reality, and they're going to do that on a global level. They don't want to be in the business of having totally different apps in every location. And I think that certainly the bigger companies have all come to the conclusion that this is the new world that we live in, and therefore they have to make their systems work within those constraints. And so this is sort of where it is. And I think it'll be interesting. It would be nice if Meta is able to do some research and share that publicly, or to enable academic researchers to look at the effectiveness of these changes. At times, Meta has been open to academic research, and at times they're not. And I don't know if they're going to do that and be willing to share the data on how well these changes are impacting things. I mean, part of the problem with this stuff is that some of the research that they've done is taken out of context. And this is a point that I've complained about in the past, where you had stories where internal research at Meta showed teens feeling bad about themselves in certain circumstances, and some number of teens. And that was interpreted as, and has been trumpeted over and over again in headlines as, Meta knew that Instagram was bad for kids, which is not what the study showed. And it showed, in certain circumstances for some kids, there were problems, and Meta looked at that as a problem that needed to be dealt with. And this is one potential result of that as well. Yeah. But because of the way that research was presented in the press, and the way the common theme is like these companies, I mean, at the COSA hearing this week in the House, constantly over and over again, you heard these elected officials saying these big tech companies, they do nothing. They don't care. They will never make changes. And we're seeing they actually are making changes, and they're willing to make changes, and they're willing to do stuff. But that narrative is still going to be there.
Yeah. I mean, we talked a bit about the kind of research around social media usage and harm for children. And there was that big University of Oxford study of studies not long ago, which you've talked about a bit. Should Instagram have made this change based upon that research? Because that research seems to suggest the point you just made there, which is only in some cases do children, teenagers suffer the harms as a result of the kind of design features and the app itself. Like, is this cracking a walnut with a hammer? Like, to kind of play devil's advocate here. I mean, to an extent, I can see the benefits for it, but have they gone a little bit too far? And maybe
I have no idea. I honestly, I couldn't tell you, and it's possible that they have, and we'll see. I mean, the simple fact is, like, reality wins out in all of these things, right? And sort of, you go back to the example of COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act in the US, and the fact that like all these limits were placed on sites that were targeted at people under 13. And what that led to eventually was kids under 13 still signing up for these things, but parents teaching them to lie, right? It was like the thing that we learned. And researcher Dana Boyd over a decade ago had done all this amazing work on sort of the end result of COPPA and how problematic it actually was, because there are people who want to use certain apps in certain ways, and they figure out a way to do it, no matter what restrictions are put on them. And so we'll see how people actually use these things. I mean, from a glance, like, most of these restrictions and defaults sound reasonable.
Yeah.
But I don't know, and I've not done the research. I would be interesting to talk to some of the researchers and hear out how they think about it. One thing I do think is interesting is that one of the arguments that I've made is that the important thing is not to just ban these kinds of apps outright, but to teach people how to use them correctly, how to use them appropriately. That is something that, like, it's sometimes referred to as media literacy, but I think it's bigger than media literacy. It's internet literacy, understanding how to use these things appropriately. And I think that's important. And I think some of the defaults, starting out as private, limiting communications, those kinds of things are like the kinds of training wheels that are actually probably useful for that. And saying like, okay, begin to recognize, enter this space more slowly. Don't be totally public from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Sounds like it's probably useful, but I don't have the data. I haven't seen it. I know that there are tons of researchers out there who are experts on this, and I hope that they get a chance to study this and give us some real information back.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true that this change places the emphasis much more on parents, obviously on the kids themselves, but also on parents, right? So you have the responsibility to adjust the settings of your child's account in a way that was opt-in before, but is now default. And that's a big shift. It's something that Adam Mosseri, the head of Instagram, shared in what I would say is quite a pointed quote to the New York Times, where he said, "We decided to focus on what parents think because they know better what's appropriate for their children than any tech company, any private company, any senator," I'm not finished, "or policymaker or staffer or regulator." I think that's a really interesting quote to share in an interview with the New York Times. And basically, kind of to your point, says, look, regulators, we're doing this, we're working on safety. It may not be to the kind of degree that you're wanting, but we're doing it. And like almost like a kind of back off, you're not needed. So it will be interesting to see how this fares, if there's research about it, if we're going to get more data about the implications, because it feels right, but we never necessarily know with these things.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, and again, like some of these things, I don't know, like stopping notifications from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. Like I totally understand that. There's been some research on that point, in fact, that is probably good. But like, it's a little weird that it's like they decide that it's 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. Like again, like maybe that's something that the parents should be able to set in terms of what the time limits are and things like that. And maybe it can be adjustable in certain cases. But yeah, it's an interesting move. It's going to be worth following. It's going to be worth seeing if other apps start doing similar stuff, and we'll see. And I know that I've definitely seen like supporters of COSA came out and said this is too little, too late, and we still need COSA and stuff like that. But we'll see. I think it's a really interesting move, and I don't think it's a cynical one. I think it's something that Meta is actually taking seriously here.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Mike, for sharing your thoughts there. We'll move on now to an AI chatbot story, which really does go to show the sublime and ridiculousness of AI use cases at the moment. Whether or not we're still in the kind of hyped phase of AI is hard to say, but you've pulled out a kind of really interesting study, Mike, on a positive potential application of AI for missing disinformation.
Yeah, this was really fascinating. It's a study that was published in Science that just came out, where they were using generative AI chatbots to see if they could counter conspiracy theories and convince people that conspiracy theories are not true. And so, there's a few thousand people in the study, and basically they found people who were willing to say that they believed in certain conspiracy theories. And then they just had a relatively short conversation with a chatbot that was trained specifically to respond to them clearly and with factual information, and give references and explain why the various conspiracy theories were wrong, and have this ongoing conversation. And it led to an actual decrease in people believing conspiracy theories, like to a significant degree. And that effect appeared to last for quite some time. So it wasn't that, just like they got through it and, went back to believing in crazy conspiracy theories, but actually
it's a lot, right? So it's like a 20% decrease in belief in the conspiracy theory and 2 months. And the research was saying that it was like versus 1 to 6% decrease in conspiracy theories for other kinds of interventions. So it's like very much outstrips other similar methods of decreasing trust in those things.
Yeah, and really interesting, because this has been like a big question for the past decade, you know, or more, where it's like people go down rabbit holes and get pulled into various conspiracy theories and then start believing all sorts of nonsense. And a big question has always been, how do you get people out of that? And we haven't had really good answers for that. And this is obviously not a perfect thing. And there are all sorts of questions about it. And how accurate is it? And is the methodology really that sound? But from what is said here, it's really, really interesting in how powerful this was. And I was thinking about it a little bit, because normally the way that people talk about getting people out of conspiracy theories, it's a lot of work. And it's really uncomfortable work in that, you can present facts to people, but it tends to get contentious very, very quickly, like in a human to human sort of situation. And that doesn't help.
Yeah.
But the one thing that is kind of amazing about these generative AI things is that they are infinitely patient. And so this is in a slightly different context, but I don't think I've talked about it on the podcast, but I've talked about it elsewhere before, that like I've been, for the last year or so, been using AI as a tool in writing tech dirt, but not in any of the actual writing. As a writer, it's terrible, and I would never trust it to write anything. But after I finish writing an article, I have a few scripts that are set up that I run against the article to discuss it. And I have like a scorecard, and I say, score this article, and it gives me back different scores and says like, this could be stronger, this could be weaker. I ask it, what are the weakest points? What are the things that people are going to complain about the most? Like, I have a whole list of questions that I ask it, and I have a conversation back and forth with the AI. And consistently, it gets me thinking more deeply, and it makes my writing stronger, because I'm like, I didn't really address that point. And it will often call out the points that I sort of, went a little too quick on the details on.
Yeah, in a way that a human colleague or editor would probably not, right? Or that
exactly
you'd get annoyed by.
Exactly, right? Yeah. And they would feel bad, like and I have human editors who review all my stuff as well, and they would, feel like, I'm not going to push Mike on this point, like, whatever, it's fine. But the AI has no qualms with that. And then on the reverse side, and I recently did an interview with Nathan Bechez, who runs the AI platform that I'm using. Right. And he pointed out something that was really interesting that I hadn't thought of before also, which is that there's something also about the AI giving you recommendations that you also feel comfortable ignoring them. Right? Like when the AI gives you a bad suggestion, you're like, whatever. Whereas if a human editor gives me a suggestion, then it's like, oh man, like if I don't agree with it, like now I gotta, I gotta have this.
There's a kind of social contract that's there,
exactly.
Right? I have to pay attention to them, otherwise they'll get sad, or like I'll have an issue on my hands.
Exactly. Yeah. And all of that is taken out of the equation when it's an AI. Yeah. And so this is really interesting to me, because it's something that I don't think anyone's really thought about. The fact that the AI is not human, even as it feels human-like, but the fact that we're not going to fight with it like we would with a human, and we're not going to have the social concerns with it as a human. We can ignore certain stuff easily, but also we can take it more seriously, and we can have a longer conversation with it without it causing problems. Yeah. Like, I'm wondering if that's what's playing into this. Yeah. And that's just like absolutely fascinating to me. Right. Because
there's a name for it, right? There's this idea of like having to contend with somebody's incessant and ongoing kind of misinformation around a topic. It's apparently called Gish Gallop.
Yes. Yeah.
And I had no idea. And it's
it's a commonly discussed thing in sort of debate circles, this idea of the Gish Gallop, which is like this idea that if you just spew so much bullshit and so much nonsense that it's impossible to refute it all. And Trump is somewhat famous for this. Like, this is his strategy in debate, but lots of others have used it as well, which is like, you just spew constant nonsense so that it is impossible for anyone to refute every single bit of that nonsense. Right. Because like you start to refute one little bit and then you're off down this whole trail just arguing about that. Yeah. And it allows the person who is engaged in the Gish Gallop to frame the debate. You sort of stray so far from reality just because you're nitpicking everything, and then they get to nitpick back. It just becomes this mess. Whereas the AI is actually so much better poised to do that than a human. There are sort of human techniques. And like I had mentioned this to you before we started recording, Mehdi Hassan, who's a well-known newscaster who now has his own media site. He wrote a book last year called How to Win. I think it's like How to Win Every Argument or something like that, which I read. I got a copy out of the library and my son saw it and was like, oh, I want that book. I was like,
you're not meant to see that.
I don't know if you should get that book. Yeah. But he has a whole chapter on like dealing with the Gish Gallop. And like there are human strategies that have been around to like how you deal with that. but I think they're different than the ones that an AI can use.
Yeah.
And so that creates this really interesting scenario where maybe this is something that is uniquely compelling that an AI chatbot can do that humans couldn't do.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing which I loved about it was that the user spoke to the AI chatbot in their own language, right? They were writing free text about the conspiracy theory that they had in mind, and they were asked to provide evidence for it. That, again, gets around this kind of idea that humans have to kind of frame an idea in a certain way. Like if you were to come to me and say, Ben, I don't think 9/11 was true. And I'd be like, what do you mean? Can you like frame it to me in a certain way? And I'd ask you to kind of frame it in a way that I understood. The AI didn't need any of that. It didn't need to kind of clarify the information in a certain way as to refute it. And I love the fact that the person holding the conspiracy theory wasn't made to kind of act in a certain way before the pushback happened. It's like, okay, like you tell me in whatever way you think this is true, and I'll come back with some evidence. And that obviously over a period of time, like did have a significant effect.
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting in the context of a different story this week, which was widely mocked and attacked. But when put next to this story, suddenly becomes a little bit more interesting, which was that there was an app that was released this week called Social AI. And everything about it sounds ridiculous and stupid. And lots of people were making fun of it. And it is an app that looks like Twitter or, any other microblogging service.
Okay.
Except if you join, there are no humans who will follow you. It is only AI. So what you post to this app, unlike Twitter or any other social media network, is never seen by any other human. What you do get then is just a bunch of responses from the different AI bots and you can choose sort of personalities for the kinds of followers that you want.
Oh my God, I'm looking at the App Store preview.
Yes.
It says, be the main character.
Yes.
Infinite AI followers, private only to you. Reflect, post, and feel heard. Oh my God, what is this?
Yes. It is a dystopian nightmare. It is straight from Black Mirror or whatever sci-fi nonsense that you want it to be from. Everything about it seems stupid. I saw people totally reasonably mocking it and pointing out how stupid and like posting really stupid stuff and having the AIs respond encouragingly, like to absolutely ridiculous posts. And I agree with all that. It is silly. It is dystopian. It is ridiculous. But take a step to the side and then look at this other story about AI convincing people away from conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
And you're like, there's something interesting about the idea of interacting with AIs when done right and when done in a useful way. This is not it. This app is not it, I don't think.
Not at scale. Right. Not at scale. It's the idea that for some people, probably not you, probably not I, probably not the many people who are mocking the social AI app launch, but for a small amount of people, this is going to serve a purpose, much like the debunk bot AI that we just talked about will serve a purpose. Like if you believe in conspiracy theories, that will serve a purpose for you. If you want to get something off your chest in a way that you can't do on a public forum or with your mates on WhatsApp or whatever it is, social AI is for you. So it's that idea that maybe AI is not for these kind of use cases, is not for everyone, but for specific sets of people to do a very specific job.
Yeah, or even imagine, right? I mean, like you could imagine a situation where before you posted something to social media, you had a bunch of AI responses first to give you a sense of how people were going to respond to stuff. I don't know if that makes sense, but I could see people wanting that.
Yeah, based upon previous similar posts.
Yep.
Based upon the kind of data set that we have available to us, this is the kind of responses you're going to get. You can amend your post accordingly to get those kind of, I can see that happening. I mean, I particularly like the data point from the research, which said that for conspiracy theories about which there was less contextual information, the bot did a still good but less good job of pulling people out of the conspiracy theory. So the example was given, I think the researchers, right after the Donald Trump assassination attempt, where he was obviously on stage and had his ear pierced by a bullet. They ran a similar experiment and they found that because there was fewer news articles, less information on the web about it, the bot didn't do as well. And for me, that's also a really positive sign for me as a journalist, the importance of news media, but also the way that AI can work in tandem with quality information produced by users or by experts. That was a really nice sign, I thought.
Yeah, and it seems like a totally understandable result. Like in the heat of things, when details are not known and there's a lot of totally unknown things going on,
Yeah.
the idea that the bot is not going to be as good at responding to those things totally makes sense. But you can see where, in conjunction with thoughtful, detailed reporting, it could get better and better over a week or a month.
Yeah.
You could see that being really useful.
And just before we move on to the next story, and probably our last story, how do you see this being kind of integrated into platforms, into other spaces? Like, surely this is something where, to have a real significant factor, needs to be taken on by a platform and used at scale, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's all sorts of interesting things, right? This is one of the questions that comes up in the trust and safety field all the time, which is like, is the best way to deal with certain information to take it down, or is it to create some sort of intervention? And I've looked at things like, there's a service called Coco, which does interventions for like teens who are thinking of like self-harm or something. If they indicate on certain platforms that Coco works with, around self-harm, it might try and get you into an intervention, which is often talking to other kids. It's actually a really interesting app and an interesting platform that focuses on that. But you could see this being a really useful tool for that kind of thing. Though I will note, Coco did experiment with ChatGPT and got trashed for trying to do that.
Right.
But done well and done carefully, you could see examples where all sorts of information, you just use the AI chatbot as an intervention, where it's like, it looks like you are posting about this kind of thing. Would you like to have a conversation here? It could be conspiracy theories, could be disinformation, but it could be eating disorder, it could be self-harm, it could be lots of categories of information that everyone is concerned about, and where the immediate reaction from a lot of people right now is, well, just ban it, the apps have to take it down. Whereas this is suggesting maybe there is another way to deal with that might be a lot more effective than just like have all this information disappear. And you can guide people towards better information, more useful information in a way that actually is helpful.
Yeah. I'm excited by this. It might be because I'm wanting to believe that it's true.
Yeah.
but I'm excited by this.
There absolutely may be confirmation bias on our part of like, this seems really cool, seems really exciting, and hopefully it's true. But yeah, we'll find out.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And then finally, Mike, we're going to whiz through this last story. I think it's worth noting because it's been a story that's been in the news for a bunch of weeks and we haven't quite touched on it, but you wanted to note the fact that Meta has finally, in the US, after banning it in other countries, in other regions, taken umbrage against RT and Russian state media for foreign interference.
Yeah, both Meta and YouTube, I think, also terminated RT accounts and other Russian state media. RT and some of these other ones have been around for a while. It's all been sort of widely recognized for a while as pretty propaganda-ish. And RT was kind of banned in the EU entirely after the invasion of Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact details.
Yeah, in 2022, both EU and UK blocked it in various forms. So I kind of forgotten all about it because I haven't seen it come across any of my platforms, but it's now global, right?
Well, it's not entirely global because RT in theory still can exist within the US. It's not illegal and it would violate the First Amendment likely, though. The whole like TikTok ban fight, which is a story we're not covering this week, even though there was a hearing on that, might get at that. And but I think under the First Amendment that the US could not ban RT from publishing content in the US. I think that would be a real First Amendment issue. But again, as we've discussed many times, platforms have their own First Amendment rights to determine who is on their platform. Yeah. And Meta and YouTube are totally free to determine that we don't want state propaganda on our platform. In the past, they've done things like label it as state-controlled media or whatever. The big thing here was that the Department of Justice came down with these charges against RT folks and these indictments with some pretty sordid details about RT through a shell or a series of shell organizations funding a bunch of social media influencers to ridiculous levels. $100,000 of video for folks like Tim Pool and Dave Rubin, and all sorts of stories are coming out of that. And this idea of like how much of how state influence and influencers interact and all of these things that I think are interesting. But just the fact that, I think it took the DOJ coming out and saying this directly and showing so much evidence of RT being engaged in really pretty bad practices that allowed Meta and YouTube to both say, that's it, we're banning your accounts on our platforms.
Yeah, it was almost impossible to be able to detect this as a policy violation, and before the DOJ came out, right? Like you can't tell the intent of a YouTuber unless you've seen the money coming into their bank account.
Yeah,
that's the killer piece of detail.
I mean, that is a really big issue, and to the extent that these bans are just on the official account. So in theory, RT could still be funding influencers, and they could still be posting, and Meta and YouTube would have no visibility into that.
And I think it's important to point out that RT have not approached Ctrl-Alt-Speech with any kinds of money, let alone $100,000 per episode. So I just want to put that on the record. That's important to say.
Yes. We are unbought off by Russian state media.
Yes.
But if somebody else wants to give us $100,000 per episode, you know where to reach us.
Yeah, I think that's an important story to kind of note. And like you say, there's a whole bunch of other stories and other information coming out about this. This is going to be an ongoing story into the US election. So expect more from this. Mike, that concludes us neatly today. We've gone around the houses. It's been great to be back on the pod with you. Thanks very much for your time. And we're going to wrap up there. Listeners, if you've enjoyed today, you know where we are. Please do rate and review us. And if you want to send us your Tinder stories as well, or your shower thoughts, find us on all well-moderated.
Or if you think we've gotten more entertaining this week, please let us know.
all that. Yeah, get in touch with us, podcast@Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you all next week.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's CTRL-Alt-Speech.com. This podcast is produced with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund, a fiscally sponsored multi-donor fund at global impact that supports charitable activities to build a more robust, capable, and inclusive trust and safety ecosystem.